Apple is starting to really purge apps from their App Store. Does this affect you? And what is your alternative choice that may actually be better? Well, stick around, wait for the end of this video for a special offer, but I'm going to tell you how to get around the Apple App Store rejection issues. Hey everybody, this is Chris Love, the owner of Love to Dev, and today I want to talk to you about Apple's recent aggressive efforts to purge hundreds of thousands of apps from the App Store. Now, at first glance, this may not sound like a bad thing because the Apple App Store, the Google Play Store, and every other app store that's out there have become extremely polluted with a lot of garbage. And we're trying to purge all of this garbage out because we want to get rid of it, because many of us feel like they're an opportunity for viruses and malware to get on our systems. And that's the initial intent of this effort by Apple. Now, their first wave removed roughly what's estimated to be about 100,000 apps. But recently, they started rejecting and purging even more applications using part of their application review guidelines in section 4.2.6, which more or less says that if your website or your application was created with an app generation service or some other scripted effort where it's essentially the same app with slightly different content and like images, colors, and text, they're going to reject your application. And this is starting to affect many businesses. The question is, on top of that is, can this affect Ionic, Cordova, React Native? Well, the answer is not yet, but in reality it probably will, because the way they worded their review guidelines is very open-ended and very vague. In fact, it clearly states in the guidelines that your app essentially cannot be a repackaged website. That's very strong words. Now, they've let a lot of apps slip in past that gate, I guess, over the years. In fact, I've said since I first started seeing the Apple App Store and then the Google Play Store that for the most part, just about every app there should be a web application and not a native app. Now, I know that's a very strong and opinionated position, but when you really look at it, there's really not any benefit of being a native app on those platforms. The real benefit is most developers never really learned how to build web applications from a mobile-first, high-performance perspective. And once you do that, you can build great web experiences. For example, Office 365 and Google Docs, both fantastic web application experiences that work cross-platform. Develop once, work everywhere. And this is one of the big drawbacks to doing native applications. That's because it costs a lot of money to build a native app, because you have to build not only the native app for iPhone, but you have to build a separate one for iPad, and then you need to build one for Android, and probably even Android tablets being a slightly different application. And this only multiplies your cost. And on top of that, the cost to develop a native application is much higher than developing a web application. Now, this policy change, or this actually enforcement of their policies, is really affecting specific targeted niches of small businesses and really businesses that just can't afford those expensive development costs. In particular, consistent industries that are being cited are like restaurants, fitness, gym type scenarios, and a lot of local businesses that have decided they have to have an app in the App Store. And I've talked to a few of these kind of business owners, and they're like, oh, I have to have an app because people only use apps. But here's the reality. No one uses apps. Oh my God, that's a big shocker right there. But the reality is, it's been over 2 years since anybody even cared about native apps on their phones. ComScore has done extensive review and study, and this has also been backed up by additional studies by other services that monitor the mobile application space. The average user no longer downloads any apps in a given month. That's right, 0 apps. And it's only getting more and more with people not downloading apps. Now, there's 2 terms that are commonly used here. One is called app fatigue, Basically, we just burned out trying to figure out if we need the latest app or not. We got burned out trying to find the coolest apps. But at the same time, it's also called peak app. There's really no more space for us to use apps. If you actually break down the application usage, it's dominated by two companies. One's called Facebook, and the other one's called Google. And the apps that they dominate with, honestly, should just be web apps. Facebook, let's face it, Facebook is a web app. All Facebook has done is they've created a closed-off browser with their own proprietary formatting infrastructure. And that who's who owns the top 4 out of 5 spots, basically, in the app usage. Facebook, Facebook Messenger, Facebook Instagram, and I forget the other one that's Facebook, but there's 4 Facebook apps in the top 10. And that's huge. Google has, the Google search is considered an app. YouTube is an app. Gmail is an app. And Google Maps is an app. Those are 4. So right there, 8 out of the top 10 are Google and Facebook. Snapchat's another one. And I kind of forget the last one that's in there. But I know after that first 5 or 6, there starts to become a big gap in usage. And after you get out of the top 10, the gap even widens more until there's almost no usage at all in a very short run. And as I survey my friends who are not geeks, not techie types who might actually want to download apps, they almost always tell me they can't even remember the last time they downloaded an app. In fact, it usually boils down to, I think the last time I downloaded an app was when I changed to my new phone and it automatically updated to the apps I already had. That's very telling. Honestly, the only time that I see their phones getting new apps or they realize they've got new apps is when their kids are playing little games on them and their kids are constantly downloading free games to play. And that's about it. So does that mean that the local businesses, small businesses should probably go after and build native applications? Yeah, probably not. And so maybe Apple's doing everybody a favor by enforcing these rather vague rules. Now, what are these vague rules? Well, there are things like it has to be app-like. And I don't know what the heck app-like really is. I tried to look around for a definition, and honestly, I found nothing out there. But to borrow language that they actually put in their review guidelines that you could tell was sort of written by a lawyer is they were quoting the Supreme Justice about pornography and saying that basically they know when something's not acceptable when they see it. And that's kind of what I think too. You know an app when you see it, and that's kind of it, right? We kind of have this idea. Now, a website, a lot of times, is just something you read and navigate through. And honestly, that's what the vast majority of apps in the App Store actually are just things to peruse through content. Now, you may be wondering, well, what about the revenue that I can get from an app? And the reality is 8 out of 10 applications never make a dime. That means they go through all the expense of having the app developed and then the marketing cost. The marketing cost of pushing native applications is through the roof. Many surveys and estimates that I see say that it takes between $2.50 to $15 in advertising cost to get a single app download. And what makes it even worse is only 1 in 10 of those app downloads are going to be used more than once. That means 90% of the dollars you spent are wasted. Or if you multiply the cost to acquire those downloads by 10, now the cost to get a real customer on your application is $25 to $150 per user. And then account that only 20% of the apps in the App Store make any money. And then when you do make money, Apple and Google all take 30% of your pre-tax revenue. That's a lot. That's a big chunk of your revenue. That can cripple a business immediately. I think a lot of people realize business margins are usually in the sub 10% range to begin with. And when you're taking 30% right off the top like that, those margins essentially are negative. This is a very poor story for apps and a very big reason why businesses should probably avoid going into the App Store. So what are your alternatives? Now, I mentioned that small businesses are the ones that are really, truly affected, and this is because they can't afford those development costs. But most of them already have a website. And what if you could just leverage that website? Well, the great news is you can. Today's world, we've got a new class of web applications called progressive web apps. Now here at Love to Dev, we're super excited about progressive web apps, and I can tell you that the browser vendors are as well. This is a term that the Google Chrome team created and got energy and support from Mozilla, Opera, and Microsoft, as well as Samsung Internet. And here's some other good news. Apple has recently started work on the features required to be a full-blown progressive web app. But more about that in a few moments. First, what is a progressive web app? Well, if you haven't seen some of my other videos or read posts that I've made, or maybe read somebody else's post or watched their video, you may be a little naive to what they are. Essentially, they're just websites, but because of the way they're developed, they take advantage of new platform features when they become available to provide an app-like experience. But on top of that, those new features are not that hard to start adding in to get that progressive web application feel. But there's more to it. Progressive web apps are all about delivering the best-in-class user experience. And that means that you need to have good practices for both development and user experience applied to your web presence. And when you do all of these things, your web presence works great for your business. And what has this shown with businesses that are already implementing progressive web apps? Well, they're seeing great positive returns. They're seeing increased sales, more customer acquisition with fewer cost, and they're seeing better customer engagement numbers all across the board. And these numbers are not limited just to browsers and platforms that support progressive web apps today. They are also reporting increases as well on iOS. And this is huge because iOS right now does not support service workers and web manifest, two of the three key technical features required to be a progressive web app. Those three features are: be served over HTTPS. This makes your website secure. And right now, about 60% of websites are using HTTPS, but the gist right now is there's no reason for you not to be serving your website via HTTPS. Google is starting to make that a bigger and bigger signal in their search engine ranking algorithm, and many platform features that you want to take advantage of are being gated behind SSL and HTTPS. The great news is there's not as many barriers for HTTPS as there was in the past. Today, you can implement HTTPS for free, and then we have to go through some gyrations to upgrade your site a little bit, your references and things like that, but that's all easily doable. Next, you need a valid web manifest file. Now, this is a JSON document that your developer can create, and it's not very big. It's just a few pieces of meta information that describe your website so that when the platform adds your website to the home screen in reaction to the user wanting to do so, they will know what icon to use to represent you on the desktop or the home screen, and they will also have a great launch experience with your brand colors, and you can control the name that's associated with your icon on that home screen. Now, it only takes a few minutes to create a web manifest file and then reference it in your website, so I encourage you to go do that today. Finally, you need a service worker. Now, service workers are a brand new feature of the web. In fact, they don't actually work in the browser. They work outside of the browser. Now, I won't get into the technical details there, but basically, your website will make all the requests through the service worker. But the service worker can execute even when the user's not on your website. This is enabling great new features like native push notifications, just like native apps have had for the last 10 years. This is making it easier and easier for businesses to engage with customers. Also, service workers, one of the key features of service workers is the ability to work offline. Now, we've been able to work offline for about a decade through something called App Cache, but it's not the cleanest specification to work with, and developers are not very happy about it. And that's one of the reasons why service worker caching was created, to make creating a web experience that works offline much easier to manage. So when you've got those three technical pieces in place, you technically qualify as a progressive web app. But there are obviously many other things you should do, and that's what we call web development and user experience best practices, which I could go on for days about those, and I won't bother you with those right now. But when you implement them, your website should and will load almost instantly, and users will be able to find the content they want and be happy and not be frustrated with your application hanging up or hiding things. So that's all great news, but I've mentioned that Apple and iOS don't necessarily support the progressive web app features just yet. But the great news is I've been building mobile-first web applications that run like native apps on all the platforms for about 7 years, using the principles behind progressive web apps. What I did has now turned into what we call a polyfill, or something that allows us to add functionality to the browser platform that isn't necessarily there yet. For example, I've been using App Cache to enable my websites to work offline. But because App Cache was hard to work with, I crafted a way for me to be able to manage caching those files and network assets that I needed to make my website work offline in other storage mediums. So when service workers aren't available, I can still fall back and use those mechanisms to make my web application work offline and load instantly. But what about push notifications? Well, the reality is push notifications are not used by that many applications. But when they are, they can be very effective. But there are alternatives. All browsers support web notifications using something called a web worker, which is kind of a precursor to a service worker. And those have been around for several years now as well. They do require the browser to be open though, whereas service worker push notifications do not. But there's still an alternative that I'd like to recommend as well. And it may even be the better one to go with, and that's text messages. Businesses that use text messages do see high rates of engagement with customers, and it may be the best alternative for you and your business. I know I get several text message offers from businesses that I've registered with that give me special offers to have me come in. For example, restaurants in the area. And I've seen studies that show that text messages can get as much as 3 times the engagement that push notifications do. So maybe you need to consider doing that, and we know how to help businesses use text messaging for their success. So here's some great alternatives to that, and that gives us some programmatic stuff, but the web manifest thing and the add to home screen, what about that, Chris? Well, if you remember back to 2007 when the iPhone was first released, there were no native applications. Apple's recommendation was a web app. And they still have the infrastructure supported in Safari to make web apps capable. In fact, that's what they call it in their documentation, mobile web app capable. So when a user adds your website to their home screen on iOS and you've got the proper meta tags set up for that, you'll get almost the exact same experience that the add to home screen experience is with a web manifest file. And we know how to do that as well, right? So all in all, you can create most of the progressive web application experience with polyfills and fallbacks on iOS and other platforms. But here's some really good news about this. Apple is actually working on service workers and the web manifest file support. Now, Apple's not known for communicating with the developer community at all. In fact, I would go so far to say that they don't really care about developers outside of Cupertino. And that's a harsh criticism on my part, but I'll stand by it. But in recent months, they have publicly given us signals that they're working on service workers by updating a page on the WebKit status site, which is where they actually tell us what they're working on as far as implementing in Safari. And then there's another signal that I found that they're actively working on the web manifest file. So these are all good things, and it all clearly indicates that they're working towards supporting progressive web applications. Now, the bad news is Apple never tells us when something's going to ship. It just shows up one day, and we all have to kind of figure it out by debugging and hacking at it ourselves. But it'll be there, hopefully, for iOS 12. That's what I think is going to happen. But since I'm not inside Cupertino's walls, I won't know. But like I said, we can make progressive web application features on iOS, and when that stuff ships, because of the nature and way you build progressive web apps, the new features will take over and the old features won't even be used. So you'll get the best available on that platform. And remember, like I said, companies that have implemented progressive web apps are seeing great returns on that investment on iOS. So there's no reason why you shouldn't want to do that. Now, if you're a business that's been thinking about shipping an app on native platforms, maybe after watching this video, you've realized it's probably a bad idea. Or maybe you're one of the companies and businesses that have been affected by the 4.2.6 rule and have had your app rejected or even removed from the App Store. You should consider progressive web apps as the more viable alternative. And we're here to help. If you're interested in pursuing that, please contact us. And we will be glad to talk to you about what can be done to help your website and web presence upgrade to a progressive web app. And if you're a developer, I've got a brand new course that goes in super detail of progressive web application development, in particular service workers, service worker caching, push notifications, background sync, and much, much more. And if you click the link in the description below, I'll give you one of the lowest prices available in this course. Now, the regular price is $200, but if you click that link, you'll be able to enroll right now and start taking that course from anywhere, anytime you need to, for just $29. That's right, $171 off the regular list price if you just click the link in the description below. So I encourage you to go do that. And again, if you've got questions about progressive web apps, leave those in the comment section below. If you think this video is helpful, hit the like button. If you think other friends or business owners or developers need to know more about this topic, share it with them as well. And don't forget, subscribe to our YouTube channel or like us here on Facebook. That way you won't miss any of the future content that we post. Thanks a lot. And even if you haven't been affected by this 4.2.6 rule, you really need to consider the Apple guidelines and how vague they are and how they might affect you. And strongly consider moving to a progressive web app, because no one can judge you there and remove you from the internet. Only you can do that. And that gives you complete control over your brand message and brand experience. And that's the big power of progressive web apps.